Everybody. So today we're going to talk about something that you wouldn't think would necessarily come up in a sociology class, but I'm going to try to convince you that it's quite reasonable that this topic come up in a sociology class, and that is the environment. And sociology has been so centered on social relationships. Remember all of that stuff from George Herbert Mead and the social self and human interaction. And then all the ways in which we get engaged in doing social surveys and ethnographic observations. That is so much about people. And yet these people are doing business in the physical environment. And that includes buildings, but it also includes nature. And so we get a chance, therefore, to talk about that physical environment and talk about nature. Woody Allen, who was the ultimate social creature, is perhaps the ultimate social creature. Woody Allen is alive. The ultimate New Yorker, and one of his many quips is that he was as two with nature, not one with nature, but two with nature. And that is a naive comment on Woody Allen's point of view. On Woody Allen's part, much as I, of course, admire and worship the ground he walks on, it's not. It's naive, and just as it would be naive to think that human beings exist ever as two with nature, we are all, in one way or another, at one with nature, and so we get to talk about that today. That's really our subject for this week. So, how do we do that, and how do we talk about that? Well, one of this as two with nature ideas has been widely held. Woody Allen is not the only one who thinks it's possible to think like that. And indeed, we could think of Woody Allen as a kind of ultimate modernist, which is not the way most people think of him, but I think it would be fair and appropriate to think of him that way. Because he's really participating in this notion that part of what it means to be alive in the 21st century or the 20th century or even the 19th century, certainly in the last half of the 19th century, is that we're done with nature. That because of all of these forces of politics, of government, of sociological organization, of corporations, of mass production, we have overcome nature, or in the language that really was used not so long ago, man has conquered nature. And so we have, in a way, put it aside. We can make the desert bloom. We can make the desert comfortable. We can live in Arizona because we've got air conditioning, and so forth and so on, right across the world. We've developed hybrid crops. We don't have to worry about eating and how to produce that eating. We've solved the problems of disaster, of starvation. Man has conquered nature. And in part, very much through sociological phenomenon, like being able to organize things in an appropriate kind of way. Well, in the 1960s, as part of the movements that led to part of the movements of feminism, of civil rights. There was also a rebellion against other aspects of what was going on in the society, and hence the birth of environmentalism. Now, environmentalism has been around actually for quite a while before that, but modern environmental movements began in the 1960s as part of these transformations and changes in the way people thought about many, many subjects. Now, one of the early orientations toward the problems of the environment took direct aim at people. In fact, couldn't take more direct aim in a way, because it said that, well, one of the slogans of the time, but from a cartoonist, very popular then, cartoon called Pogo, was that we have met the enemy and he is us. That there are just too many people to get right to the core of it. And the person who was the most famous, and he was on all the talk shows again and again and again, was a guy, a Stanford professor of biology named Paul Ehrlich, who wrote a book appropriately titled, given what he was trying to do. It was called The Population Bomb. Not very subtle there, is it? That tells you exactly who the enemy is. And the enemy is that there are just too many people on Earth. Now, in bringing that up, and in that way, sort of, he was echoing a set of ideas that actually had been around for a much longer time, really to the 17th century. I said in one of the other sessions that the founder of modern economics was Adam Smith, but sometimes that title is not given to Adam Smith, but is given to a man who many of you I know have already heard about and are familiar with, and that is Thomas Malthus. And Malthus wrote about the problem of what came to be called, he didn't use it exactly this way, the problem that is the tragedy of the commons, which is a more modern 20th century formulation of the problem that Malthus was talking about. And imagine a commons. Imagine that the village has an area in the center which everyone can share. And it's, you can use it to graze your cattle, to raise your crops, to put your sheep. And it is in your interest, and this is the tragedy part that both Malthus and the later more modern formulators had in mind when they talked like this. It is in each individual's interest to put as many sheep as possible on the commons. And they will keep doing that. They will keep putting more and more sheep on the commons until the commons can't handle any more sheep. And when that happens, it isn't just that the last person is told, no, you can't come in the way that the last person at the movie theater is told, we're full, you can't come in. By the time you've reached that point, what you have destroyed the commons. For example, if you're grazing animals on grasses, you will eventually eat all the grasses and subject it to erosion. When erosion occurs, when the rains come, then the topsoil will be washed away, and you will have catastrophe. That's the tragedy. It isn't just that the last people who are trying to get on the lifeboat, the last people who are trying to get into the commons, won't have room for them. We won't have room for them, and there will be what the demographers call a die-off, in which those extra people can't survive. It's that the entire carrying capacity will collapse. The ecological system will collapse. Well, if you move this vision up from the green commons in the village to spaceship Earth, as it's later, much later, came to be called, then you see the looming catastrophe in general, and of things like global warming, for example, that eventually will reach a point, not only will there be no more room for X person's extra garbage, but instead the entire thing will go into an irreversible collapse. And that kind of catastrophe is the great disaster waiting to happen if we don't grapple with this. Now, some people, of course, think that there's always been a way in which technology has saved us, but we do know that many of the commons of the world have in fact gone away, and that many of the deserts of the world, in North Africa, for example, are the result of prior overgrazing, in effect, overuse. And that's where our deserts come from. Some of them, indeed, are due to the fact that there hasn't for eons been appropriate rainfall to support a different kind of ecology. But some of them, a large percentage, are actually due to human intervention, which has created irreversible consequences, or certainly extremely difficult to reverse consequences. So it isn't completely silly to be worried about this phenomenon. Because Malthus was an economist, the field of economics has sometimes called the dismal science, because it just sees that way of doing things as what is built into human nature. And so there is always this terrible dilemma that people will, acting selfishly, which is good according to people who do market thinking, economists indeed, as people do this individualistic action, if they engage in this kind of opportunism, they will, in effect, kill themselves off. They will kill all the geese that lay their golden eggs, and hence it's a tragedy, and that is a dismal orientation to the world, hence economics as the dismal science. Now, of course, many economists don't accept that, and they don't believe it, and neither do sociologists, and hence enter sociology and how they will save the world by helping us to think in a different kind of way. Now, one of my people that I think has helped a lot to help sociologists think differently about all of this, and he was not a popular writer, so in this room I can just bet you no one except me has ever heard of him, except that if sociology had a Nobel Prize, he would have won the first one. Not just for this, but for many, many, many important works that he did. But anyway, he has a kind of funny name. It's Dudley Duncan. Dudley Duncan, a very funny name. It's even funnier because his full name is Otis Dudley Duncan. Otis Dudley Duncan came up with a scheme that has a kind of lovely feeling to it. It's poet. Isn't that sweet? Isn't that nice? Isn't that not dismal? And in a way, it's not dismal because Duncan says that there are really four factors that go into creating a civilization and make it be alive and allow it to survive. And they're all in interaction with one another. So P stands for, let's do a little Sesame Street here. P stands for population. O, and you sociology students now will get onto this. You know just where this is going. Organization. That's our big, fabulous sociological element in poet. And then environment is what this week's lesson is about. Nature and the physical environment that, that surrounds us. And then T, anybody want to? Technology is right. That man has just won $85 on low-budget programs like this. Technology. There you go. There are these four elements, but also these elements are always in interaction with one another. So people, however many there are doing things like digging. And building pyramids, and inventing cars, and drilling for oil. They're doing all of those things. They are using technology in doing it. They're organized like the modern corporation that allows so many of the things I just rattled off, or explorations, as when Queen Isabella said, "Go get me stuff." Those are organizational forces that people put into motion, which, of course, impact the environment in major, major ways. By today, we would say polluting the world. In those days, we would have said by making things nicer, by putting beaches and resort hotels on that very land that Christopher Columbus stuck his pole in the sand and said, "This is for Queen Isabella." And now let's get our microbes spread among those people. And then that came back on them, now didn't it? And affected the population in one of the great historic die-offs in the history of the world. So all of these, I think I hit all of them, didn't I? You can go through anything and go through the same sort of pattern. So smog in Southern California, or wherever it strikes its ugly head. it can be understood in much the same way. And Duncan indeed used smog as one of his illustrations of how you could understand the way the world works only by seeing these four forces as in continuous interaction. Lots of people move to Southern California. That move is made possible by the history of colonialism, by the deaths of the native peoples, and there they are. They use technology to create a source of oil. Other people do, but sometimes the people are in indeed Los Angeles, because Southern California first began its oil development only 2 years after Titusville in Pennsylvania and the discovery of oil and it's the capacity to commercially exploit it only 2 years later, which delivered very cheap gasoline, which eventually makes possible, not so far into the future, the development of cheap automobile transportation, which then pumps all kinds of crap into the environment, the very sunshine, beautiful skies environment that brought many of these white people into Southern California in the first place. And so it goes. Then the air is destroyed, pollution happens, people are dying at an earlier stage of life than they otherwise would, and there you go. But along comes, and here's our ray of hope and sunshine that's coming on this little story, because what eventually happens is that some people in California say, wait a minute, this has got to stop. And they pass legislation. Jerry Brown, who's come back again into the politics of California, becomes governor. Many other things happen. The environmental movement takes hold. That's still another movement of that time. And new laws are passed. And as a result of the new laws being passed, the environment is much improved. The rates of smog go down a whole lot. More people live than would otherwise have done so. And it's made possible by changes in technology, which, among other things, are urged on by this new legislation and this O that's located there as the second piece of the poet's scheme. So a never-ending set of dynamic movements between these various elements of population, environment, and technology. And mostly, of course, we concentrate on the O, because that's where the sociological magic happens. And this is the sociological class. You all know that now there is a thriving environmental studies department here at NYU. We're the last significant university to ever have one because of the Woody Allen instinct, I fear. But now Woody loses, and the environment gains a friend in the NYU department. Well, what about that population bomb and all of that? Where are we with all of that? Because the scheme of POET still leaves plenty of room for population to be seen as a major force. In order to get all of this going, to get attention on the other pieces of the puzzle, for the modern environmental movement to overcome the influence of Paul Ehrlich just having really chosen one thing, there have been a lot of arguments put forward to try to overcome that. And just the other day, I was somewhere on a panel, and the person I shared the program with does the same thing again. It's like sitting with Paul Ehrlich. We have too many people. If we don't get a handle on this problem, we can't solve any problem. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, important people still think like that, and we've got to do something. Well, I'm going to lecture in Sichuan. That's what I'm going to do to try to change this way of thinking. Well, so here I am, and here we go. One thing is what we know is that a prime impact on birth rates is things that take place within that O. So, for example, literacy. If you can create literacy, you cause birth rates to drop. And we watch that happen all over the world. So the Paul Ehrlichs of the world think that that the problems of, for example, people not having resources and governments not having resources to educate people is because we have too many people. If you have too many people, there are too many on the commons, you have to service their needs, and there's nothing left over, for example, to help build them schools. You'll never build enough schools for all of those children. But wait a minute, maybe it works the other way around, that the number of people that we have is actually due to how much education we have. So the place to intervene is in organizationally, doing things like getting hold of politics or influencing politics, and then changing the amount of literacy and illiteracy in the world, and then there will be decreases in birth rates. Another thing that we notice is that some people of the world have transformed their birth rates through other processes which are beyond literacy, although literacy is indeed part of it, but in effect a super modernization of the way people live and the way people think. So Italy, for example, which is a Catholic country, Catholicism is both the official language of the country, official religion of the country, as well as the massively practiced religion of the country. And we used to think that the Italians had among the highest birth rates in the world because they were following religious doctrine. But in fact, these other factors that make up the organizational structure of society, which may have to do with the changing role of women in the world, the coming of industrialization, and the modernization of the economy and the transformation out of basic field and farming rural economies, transformed the Italian birth rate. And so Italy, it may still be the case, but in recent years, Italy went from among the highest birth rates in the world to the lowest birth rate in the world. And the Italians are not reproducing themselves. They have zero population growth. They have lower than ZPG, zero population growth. And so, wow, something can happen. And this runs very counter to this idea of the tragedy of the commons, at least when it comes to human reproduction. They don't just keep doing it, do they? I'm sure the Italians, I'm not sure of anything, but I assume the Italians are having sex, and maybe even more than ever, and maybe more enjoyable than ever. But they are not reproducing themselves like they used to, and indeed are not reproducing themselves at all. There's also a world-famous economist named Amartya Sen, I'll give you his last name, who works in Britain, I think at Cambridge University. He's quite old now. He's of Indian origin. And Sen points out, he thinks, that women's rights are critical to this dynamic. So it's another organizational factor. That if women have control over their own bodies, and he's thinking about third world environments and developing countries like India, but also sub-Saharan Africa, where reproduction rates are very high, he thinks that where women have, in effect, this modernistic notion that they control their own bodies, and that means they will be not as subject to men's whims for sexuality under conditions that men dictate, which is regardless of where they are in their cycle, regardless of whether birth control of any means is being used by anybody. So the best way to get a hold of the reproduction issue is by changing the social organizational reality. And that in particular means providing women with more rights and capacities than they otherwise would be entitled to. So gender enters into the apparatus, and how gender relations are organized. One of the themes that we took up earlier earlier in the class. So those are some bullet points of how to understand the contingency of population and how it operates in the world. And indeed, whether or not it increases or decreases, that it's due to these other factors which come first in the causal chain, or at least are in dynamic relationship with it, which would be Duncan's way of thinking. Now, here are some other attacks, and these I'm sure will be familiar to many of you, but maybe not to all of you. And I can give you the data. How many vegetarians do we have in the room? Well, okay, great. So you are already sold. Thank you for participating in today's survey. About a third, I saw roughly a third of the people in this room. And vegetarianism in the United States is itself a social movement, not necessarily completely organized, although somewhat organized, that has changed things, especially in sophisticated environments such as this, and make this kind of data I'm now going to give you not quite the data that we would find outside this room. So in the United States, the average American eats, you want to know the number? I know you want to know the number. In the course of a year, 1,460 pounds of meat. And that is like a whole lot. Versus in the rest of the world, it is 255 pounds per head of human. So we are really, we are meat eaters. And as you know, the fact that our taste runs to meat, that we've organized so much of our society around meat. McDonald's is the street corner place. Meat and coffee is what is, I think, our most common retail environmental experience. So it is all so readily available. And of course, the fact that we have the taste for it, which is cultural. Many people of the world do not eat meat. I just want to make that in a way forcefully, that what we take to be perhaps a natural thing to do is not natural at all. We have about a third of the students in this room who don't eat meat, but when you look around the world, there are hundreds of millions of people who don't eat meat. And among people who do eat meat, there are tremendous variations in what meats they will eat and what meats they will not. So Islamic people, Hindu people large numbers don't eat meat at all, but Islamic people and Jews don't eat pork. Now, I go to the pork business story because some of you are Jews, and maybe you keep kosher or live a kosher life, or at least don't eat pork. The ways in which people will not eat certain things, they will not eat horses, for example. And I think probably no one in this room has eaten horse. And if I told you that's what we're having for lunch, you would be appalled. There's nothing, of course, wrong with horse meat. I've heard it's good. I don't know. Some people don't eat rabbits because they're too cute. There are various things that people don't do. My point in raising this is to get at how taste varies and how deeply held are these notions of what you should eat and what you shouldn't eat. So my point is that the reason why we use up so much of the common for the purpose, the environmental common, for the purpose of raising meat, is not due to the fact that we have so many people. It's due to the fact that the zeal for meat is held by so many people who can command the resources, who are organized in order to get it done. And that means, of course, a great deal of earth is polluted. A great deal of topsoil is destroyed. A great deal of industrialization takes place. A great deal of methane is put into the atmosphere. All sorts of bad things happen from not people, not from population per se, but rather by what their proclivities are, in terms of the fact that it's like not liking Chevrolets, but in fact wanting nobody wants Toyota anymore, a Hyundai, or whatever that taste sensibility might be. Except the food sensibilities are much deeper than attachment to a brand of car. But it is something that varies around the world, not because people can have it or can't have it, but because of these deep cultural preferences that people have or don't have, and the way they're organized to be able to have it or not to be able to have it. So more data. I've given you the meat story. If we look at resources in general, people have tried to figure out how much resources are used by people in the rich countries compared to those in the poor countries. The most extreme piece of little factoid that I've seen is a comparison between Americans, who are, of course, the gluttons of resources of the world, and Ethiopians, who use very little of the world. And that ratio is 365 to 1. The average American uses 365 times the resources of an average Ethiopian in this world. So that means that if you just look at a glance at a number like that, it starts telling you once again that the P thing is not the central problem that we have. It's rather how we owe it, the letter O, and the way we T it, attach it to that O to various technologies, and the kinds of consequences that then happen on the E, on the environment, and how that works. So the world is differently organized to make different kinds of things happen. And we have, again, the good news, the sunshine in all of this, is that we see that rapid rates and changes have taken place, just like in birth rates, well, in other forms as well. So one of the, to pick up Otis Dudley Duncan's musings about Southern California and pollution again, we can talk about the car. And it was not only an organizational feat to create cars, create highways, create cheap oil, and all of that, and in the internal combustion engine, rather than, say, steam engines, which were being developed at about the same time as the automobile engine. The arrival of the cheap oil pushed car production in the direction of the gasoline-powered engine, as opposed to the steam-powered car engine, which existed at the same moment. If the cheap oil hadn't have come, we probably would not have the automobile engine that we do. But anyway, that's the way it happened. And at a certain point, I think it might have been in the late 1940s, 1950s, it was decided that, that our fuel for cars could be improved by putting lead in the car, lead in the fuel, lead in gasoline. And when I was growing up, that was proclaimed with great pride, that there was lead in the gasoline at this gas station. I don't know if it was Exxon. There wasn't Exxon then, whatever it was, as opposed to the other competition, which didn't have lead in their gasoline. And so all the companies put lead in the gasoline. It turns out that lead, which was supposed to make your car engine run better, in fact was a detriment to your car engine. But by then, a huge following had developed for having lead in the car, in the fuel. It later turned out that lead was having horrible effects on, horrible environmental effects. I think some of the people who we see stumbling around New York, who don't know where they are and what they're doing, some of those people, crazy people, wingnuts, as Denier's people sometimes call them, these people are victims of lead poisoning, either in paint or in gasoline of a prior era. It's been taken out of the paint. Lead is no longer legal in paint. It has been taken out of the fuel, and now our quality of life has been much improved. And the people who were most vulnerable have made particular gains. And those people who are vulnerable are poor people who tend to live proximate to highways and highway interchanges where the air is worse from automobile exhausts, and from people who live in old buildings that are badly maintained or are using old products which contain lead from a prior era. Taking lead out of products has reduced the amount of lead in the brain of Americans, and that's been well documented. And many people are having better lives than they otherwise would. This possibility, by the way, that the environment and intervening in the environment has unequal consequences has been much developed by a social movement that came after the initial environmental movement, but is very much alive and well, and it is the movement for what's called environmental justice. And that means that the goal of environmentalism should not be to save species and cute species and let it go at that, or even sometimes it is argued that much of the environmental movement is off target because it doesn't pay attention to the detrimental effects of a bad environment on specific populations, that we have to stop dumping our garbage where the poor people of the United States live, and dumping our garbage where the poor people of the world live, which is where so much of our trash increasingly goes, like our computer parts that are no longer used, that end up in a third world setting where those people have to deal with the consequence. Okay, so let's continue our march through O and the way in which organizing the world, i.e. sociologically participating in the world, creates so many of these environmental consequences. So last time I talked about the modern corporation and its birth. And since the vast amount of activity that occurs in the world now happens through the economy and through corporations, then it means that all of those mechanisms that Maureen Jung, who was the former student of mine whose work I brought to your attention, all of those activities are environmental interventions. That whatever corporations do that affect the environment are a result of the ways in which they're organized and the way in which they are not organized. So how do we intervene? I mentioned before the successes, that we've taken lead out, that California has led the country in terms of improving air quality through regulations that have been put into place. Regulations are maybe an answer, maybe the answer, but it's also the case that there is resistance to regulation. And every day's newspapers are, of course, filled with stories of the way in which corporations, just like in the way Maureen Jung was talking about it in the late 19th century, that those corporations don't just lie and play dead. They're very active in making these things not happen or happen and change the way in which it works. They are joined, and if we talk about politics and the political economy, which I did so much of last week, they're joined by many ordinary people in the United States who think that government is always a threat, even when that government is engaged in organizing the corporation for what the advocates of change think of as the public good. So we have increasingly learned, and this is not sort of a friendly amendment to Marxists and people who make and see right mills and the idea of the power elite, and the people who think that these elites run everything. We are increasingly disturbed, we who might believe that, by the evidence that ordinary Americans, as evidenced by the Tea Party in the currently in the news, that ordinary Americans joined forces with these corporate elites. Knowingly or unknowingly, that's a subject that probably scholars are just only now investigating. But we do know that the Republican Party and the anti-regulatory elements of the Republican Party have many people in them whose privileges and rights would be enhanced by the regulatory schemes of the Democrats, which they then resist and they fight. So whether it's coming from the corporations or whether it's coming from their allies, there are resistances that need to be taken into account. And I just want to give you a couple of ideas about that resistance that are not in the papers, but they're kind of overarching phenomena that we've realized really now for several generations are built into the dynamic of American politics and thus affect the environment as well as many other things. And one of them is the idea of capture. And what capture means, and this has been developed primarily by political scientists in the US, capture means that the industries that are to be regulated capture the people who are regulating them. So they capture the government agencies. So the Security and Exchange Corporation, which was created to be our guardian of the marketplace and a fair marketplace, and minimize opportunism and ways of rigging markets and ways of exploiting the system in order to keep that greatest good for greatest number alive. We know that these financial overlords created by the government, some of them as a result of Franklin Roosevelt and the Fair Deal, that they get captured by the very industries that they are supposed to regulate. And how would they get captured? They get captured in a number of ways. First of all, when we talked about the media, there's the issue agenda. What these regulatory agencies do is boring. And the scandals, the issues, the problems that go on are ordinarily not part of our media scape. And that's why, for example, nobody, quote, nobody, the vast majority of us never saw this financial catastrophe coming because it happened through a series of decisions, non-decisions that were made going back to the Clinton administration, but then intensifying under President Bush, that each in their individual quality is utterly boring and utterly tedious. So unlike the slogan I gave you when we talked about newspapers, if it bleeds, it leads, there's no bleeding and there's no imminent catastrophe. It isn't like a fire in Chinatown here in New York where 30 people are killed, or there's the sensation of a vast amount of flames going up into the sky. Nothing like that is going on. And so that enables anyone who is really motivated to read the fine print, to visit their politicians, to indeed do so and be able to have an influence that they might otherwise not have had. So there is capture that takes place. And then, of course, there's campaign contributions that are made to the politicians who are supposed to be supervising these government agencies, and that those campaign contributions are heavily directed toward the very people who in Congress are supposed to be doing the oversight committees, as they're called, of those government agencies that the lobbyists are most concerned about influencing. The other term that has often been used by the political scientists is the term of cooptation. And that is that the people who are running those agencies, even when they want to do differently, are co-opted eventually. And they're co-opted by lawyers who give them good arguments, but they're also co-opted by their own employment opportunities. So to just give you one prominent example right now, Timothy Geithner, who is the Secretary of the Treasury, has made his life he's made his life, a lot of it on Wall Street, but not himself as a trader. He has been primarily a government servant, a bureaucrat, as they like to say. And of course, he's had a huge, wonderful salary, and I'm sure he lives a very high standard of living and has been living that high standard of living. But when he leaves his office, when President Obama tells him it's time to go, or when he says, I want to spend more time with my family, he will be ushered into the major financial corporations of the world. And he will, I think, it's safe to say, I'll bet, die a billionaire rather than die a millionaire. To the degree to which, if you are regulating an industry that will want you eventually, then you're going to have a much more lucrative future than if you are involved in evaluating and regulating an industry and a sector that is not going to want you. And again, we refer to this as a revolving door. We have many, many examples of this. How people leave the timber industry, this was especially true under the Republicans, leave the timber industry and become part of the Department of the Interior. Then they leave the Department of the Interior and they go back to the timber industry or to the mining industry. A revolving door which keeps the influence of the industries within the regulatory apparatus, both because of where the people have been beforehand and where they're going to go afterward. And it further fuses the regulators with the regulated, and in a way that is only a little bit subtle, but that goes on and doesn't change. Well, how else does, so this has worked, and people have written, both historians and political scientists and sociologists have done the long march through all the regulatory agencies, through the Environmental Protection Agency, through the timber industry, the trucking industry. We subsidize trucks in a way we don't railroads, cars and freeways in a way we don't, mass transit and trains, and we just keep that going on and on. According to, again, another one of my former students here at NYU, who did a wonderful PhD on the garbage, her name, M-A-C, Samantha McBride. She works for the city's sanitation department as an official. She doesn't actually pick up the trash. And Samantha took up the subject of recycling. And here's the unhappy recycling story. Recycling accounts for, in its potential, 2% of the waste produced in the United States. 2, I said TWO. I didn't say that 2% of the waste is recycled. I said 2% is potentially recyclable under our system that we have of curbside recycling and all the places we put our bottles and cans and all the rest of it. It is hugely successful. Some cities now recycle 50%, 60% even of all their trash. Maybe even some are higher. Those are the numbers I know. And they're moving higher and higher and higher. And so isn't that a fabulous thing? And in a way it really is, because it shows the lack of selfishness in the society. It shows there is a capacity to organize it all and have the blue trash bins as opposed to the white trash bins. And all of us do it. We walk around with our plastic bottle in fear of putting it in the wrong place. And I think even we do it in New York. Other cities like Aspen, Colorado, or Boulder, Colorado, or in California, those people are really religious about it. So we have all of this massive human behavior going on that is not self-seeking, unlike, say, the economists would have it as a fundamental notion that everyone is self-seeking. But that's not the case, because we are doing all this massive recycling. But it doesn't amount to much in the larger scheme of things. And that's because about 90%, according to Samantha McBride, about 90% of the waste generated in the United States is by production. So it's not the bottle and what we do with it as consumers that matters. It's instead what went into making the bottle in the first place and making the beverage in the first place. That's what created the pollution. It's not what NYU will do with the seats that you're sitting on once it decides to remodel this building and puts them in the trash heap, which is not cool. But that's not the problem. The problem is what it took to create the seats that you're sitting on, and that, of course, also are destroying your body and interfering in your bowel movements, as well as many other evil attributes that those are doing. But it's the production of them that's the problem. And McBride says that evolved historically because of the fact that the corporations joined in the recycling movement and supported it with great enthusiasm. This was not a danger to them in a way that interfering with the production apparatus would have been. And so it's a matter of political reality. The shift takes place, and she traces out how gradually over recent history the environmental movement and environmental organizations became altered in the direction, the preponderant direction of their organizing and lobbying. And in effect, the environmental movement was, to put it in extreme terms, captured or co-opted into this direction of being non-hazardous to corporations as opposed to being non-hazardous to human beings. So it goes. The corporations are now, in many cases, our largest corporations are larger than whole countries in the world in terms of the amount of revenues that they have, in terms of their richness, and in terms of their capacity to exert influence, not only in the United States, but in other parts of the globe as well, although the US is maybe among the most sympathetic. Now, I'll give you another factoid that you may enjoy. We have much discussion now about where our future energy is going to come from. And once again, we have that set of choice points, which is, do we do renewable resources? Do we do nuclear? Or do we continue with coal and petroleum? And of course, the corporations are setting themselves up differently depending upon where they are in all of that apparatus and what it is that they do. But the point is they are part of the events that will take place in terms of who's been captured, who's been co-opted, and what will actually be the outcome. And I, for one, don't believe that it is necessarily the truth that the corporations will lose. And it might be that particular ones will lose and other ones won't. So President Obama has endorsed the nuclear industry and will engage in massive government subsidies of the nuclear industry. But he seems less keen on coal, although he's even a bit pliable on that, as well as oil and offshore oil drilling. But to give you a coal factoid, that's what I started out wanting to give you, the estimates are that our coal plants emit enough pollutant to result in 24,000 deaths annually in the United States that are preventable deaths through the pollution of the air. Each of these things that goes on in the environment can be quantified too often and turned into deaths per annum. Secondhand smoke in the United States kills about 14,000 people every year in ways that otherwise wouldn't occur. So when you manipulate the environment, you're manipulating life and death and distributing it differently than it otherwise would be distributed, since as a rule of thumb, it's poor people who are going to get dumped on more than other kinds of people. Well, again, I want to I keep mentioning the sunshine, the rays of sunshine in all of this. We have cleaned up the waterways of the United States in remarkable degrees. During the Bush administration, some of these were reversed. mining safety, some compromises were made, but in the history of mines in the United States, the regulation of mining has caused there to be a drop of 3/4 in the number of people who die in mining. It's just another way of saying that these interventions can take place, and these interventions can make their move, can work. Well, finally, how can I bring your attention to some still larger issues? And that's what I want to do right now. It is often put that there is a trade-off that must be made between the environment on the one hand and the economy on the other. And indeed, that's been made at the presidential level. One of the bases of the popularity of President Reagan, Ronald Reagan, he ran on this, of morning in America, he said, that there was no reason for Americans to be deprived of their standard of living. And that meant for him, bring on the oil, bring on the coal, let's decrease our restrictions on the environment. He wasn't totally successful in that, but anyway, that was the direction of his thinking. And President Carter, who was running for re-election, pressed forward the idea that no, it's a time for sacrifice because of all of these anxieties about the environment. That turned out to be a terrible strategy that, looking back, everybody believes, because Americans don't want to be told that they need to sacrifice in their material lives for anything, and that the environmental difficulties, which are these slow, gradual, mostly invisible problems that come down the pike, are just not going to get a good answer. Well, what I want to do is try to complete that loop and say that there are ways in which there is no opposition between the economy on the one hand and environment on another. And that's true in a number of ways. One way is the way we measure the economy and how we think about it. We use, it used to be, we've refined it since, the gross national product. Sometimes it's called the GDP, the gross domestic product. And that is the scale of all the economic activities that take place in the United States. And that GNP or GDP is the bellwether of how well we're doing. It's the summary statistic. And if the GNP goes up, we're doing great. If the GNP or GDP goes down, we're not doing so well. And you can do that state by state. They figured out ways to do it for cities by themselves. What's the total volume of all economic activity? Well, I had an economist, a professor when I was an undergraduate, who thought this was a terrible statistic, a terrible way of understanding how well people are doing, how well we're doing. And rather than gross national product, he said it really should stand for the words gross national pain, because all it measures is how much work it is to get our lives lived. So if, for example, we lived in a paradise, Eden, in fact, where all you had to do was put your hand up and grab lunch, and the temperature never went below 70 degrees and never went above 72 degrees, then that would have a gross national product of 0, right? And yet you are in paradise. Paradise has a gross national product of 0. So how come we just want to get farther and farther from paradise? And the farther we get from paradise, the better we think we're doing. So the sale of tobacco counts as a positive in the gross national product. All like that. The sale of the cigarettes adds to the gross national product. And then the surgery for lung cancer that NYU Hospital performs also counts in the gross national product. So what you're just showing is that in this case, this, because it's consumed in both the consumption of the cigarettes and the consumption of the surgery to deal with the cigarettes, and then of course also the funeral expenses and the flowers, all of that goes on the plus sign of a good economy. And that then raises the point, and people like my economics professor that I had as an undergraduate, is to say, no, no, no. Having these economic statistics is not sufficient. We have to think substantively about what we're getting as we go through our pain, as we do our effort. What are we getting out of it? And so it is that certain things are not counted. So when the coal companies pollute the air, we have to pay, or at least I think we do in places I've lived, you have to pay for the garbage to be picked up. When I lived in California, it was private, so I had to write a check every month to the garbage company for picking up my garbage. In a city, the city has to pay for the garbage to be picked up. If you operate a coal plant and the coal and you're finished with the production apparatus and it goes up the smokestack and into the air, it's garbage in another form. But you're paying nothing for that garbage to enter the world. And nobody's buying it, literally. Nobody's buying your garbage. Nobody's being employed to take away your garbage. It's just going. And so it's not part of the GNP. It is not deducted from the GNP. It's a hidden cost. So all our environmental costs are hidden. So they're just there. That's the point. And if we can get the GNP up, it doesn't matter that we're getting the hidden costs up as well. And economists have a word for those hidden costs. I think I've given it to you in the past, and it is externality. That they notice, economists do, that sometimes when people do things, there are external consequences. And sometimes they are negative externalities. And when these negative externalities occur, there is no way for them to be built into the market. So there's no way when you buy a pack of cigarettes for it to also, the price, to contain the cost of, for example, the treatment in the hospital for the people who get lung cancer. And that then throws the whole thing off. So one final way in which we can think about the environment and the economy as not being in opposition to one another. And that is that so many economic activities have little environmental consequences, or at least less than others. And the whole development of the so-called learning economy, the postmodern economy, the creative economy, the kinds of things that go on, for example, on your iPhone and iPod, so much of that, it consists of human beings sitting on chairs in front of a screen and figuring out in new ways what to do. And it has a whole lot of different consequence on the environment compared to other activities. Not to say that Apple Computer doesn't have environmental consequences. They do. But if you stack up, say, the Apple Corporation or Hewlett-Packard versus Exxon versus the coal companies and the petroleum industry, the chemical industry, a very small number of operators, of industries and corporations create the great preponderance of pollution in the world, including global warming as a problem. And getting control of them is quite critical. So the idea that there is an opposition between the environment on the one hand and the economy on the other causes us not to pick and choose and think about, well, which types of economic activities are actually the most destructive? And maybe we need to regulate those more and regulate the so-called creative economies in a way that encourages their growth and development, Let's bring on the alternative technologies, the appropriate technologies, the renewable energy technologies. Let's get them going. Otherwise, if you just think that regulation for the benefit of the environment is a cost, you miss the boat that sometimes it's more of a cost than other times. And the evolution of the economy and where the wealth is increasingly, obviously, not in those exploitative economies that have the worst effect on nature, but on those economic sectors which actually, right on the surface, have less economic detrimental, less environmental detrimental consequences than the ones who are the most backward in the society. And I use the word backward not only because they're at the backward end of the history of economic development, but also backward in that they are the most resistant to social change. They are the most lined up with the anti-regulatory ideologies in general. In other words, Steve Jobs, I don't know his politics, but I assume he's probably an Obama guy, as opposed to the oil industry, which is very lined up historically with, well, President Bush was went through the revolving door of mineral extraction, including the oil industry. So it's all, once again, aligned. And what I'm trying to do is get you to think about the fact, to question this idea of economy and environment as having some oppositional quality. See you on Thursday as we wend our way.